So here's the thing about interstellar academies. They're basically like regular schools, except instead of dealing with lunch money bullies, you've got six-armed crystalline beings from Kepler 442b who think your bone density is quaint, and slug people from the Andromeda Spiral who consider oxygen a recreational drug. Fun times. The Galactic Educational Consortium Academy Station 7 was what you might generously call a melting pot of species. Though personally, I'd describe it as more like a cosmic zoo where someone forgot to install proper barriers between the exhibits. 3,000 students from 400 different worlds, all crammed into a spinning metal can hurtling through space at speeds that would make Einstein weep. And in the middle of this beautiful disaster was one human cadet who'd somehow convinced the admissions board that Earth wasn't actually a nightmare death world populated by psychotic apex predators wearing meat suits. Spoiler alert, they were wrong about that last part. Cadet Marcus Vale. Yeah, that's right. A guy who'd grown up thinking diplomacy meant not punching someone in the face immediately, was sitting in advanced xenobiology, trying very hard not to laugh as Professor Kethvar attempted to explain why human reproduction was statistically improbable and evolutionarily concerning. This was particularly amusing since Kethvar's species reproduced by literally exploding into a cloud of spores every few decades. But sure, human reproduction was the weird thing. The human gestation period, Kethvar was saying, his 6 eyes stalking independently as he gestured at the holographic display, requires the female to carry developing offspring internally for approximately 9 standard months, during which time she experiences severe physical and hormonal changes that would incapacitate most sentient species. Marcus raised his hand. Several nearby students instinctively flinched, a learned response after 3 months of watching this particular death worlder contribute to class discussions. Yes, Cadet Vale? Kethvar's tone carried that special mixture of academic curiosity and existential dread that most professors developed when dealing with human students. Quick question, Professor. When your people go through the sporulation cycle, don't you literally die in the process? Like consciousness completely ceases to exist for several months while your organic components randomly recombine? The silence that followed was deafening. Kethvar's eye stalks curled inward, the Zenthari equivalent of clearing your throat uncomfortably. That is a considerable oversimplification of a complex biological process, he managed. Right, but you do die, though. Temporarily. Whereas human women just get cranky and crave weird food combinations. Marcus grinned, showing teeth that made several nearby students shift nervously in their seats. Seems like we got the better end of that evolutionary deal. From somewhere in the back of the classroom, someone muttered something in what sounded like contemptuous vegan dialect. Marcus's enhanced hearing, another fun death worlder trait that the other species found deeply disturbing, caught every word. Typical mammalian arrogance. He turned around slowly, still grinning that predator's smile that his species was famous for. The entire class seemed to freeze, except for 4 students in the back row, who were trying very hard to look innocent. There was Zektal, a vegan from the militant outer colonies. Basically a 7-foot-tall mantis with an attitude problem and delusions of superiority. Next to him sat Vrax, one of those silicon-based rock creatures from the Titan cluster, who communicated through subsonic vibrations and considered carbon-based life structurally inadequate. Then there was Seth, a snake person from New Cobra whose species had never quite gotten over the fact that mammals had out-evolved them back when Earth was still cooling. And finally Marok, a chunk of living crystal from the Prism Worlds who glowed ominously when annoyed. They'd been giving Marcus grief since day 1, and frankly, he was getting tired of it. Did someone have something to add to the discussion? He asked sweetly, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent classroom. Because I'd love to hear more about mammalian arrogance from a species that thinks photosynthesis makes them morally superior. Zektal stood up, his multiple joints clicking as he unfolded to his full height. At least we don't need to consume other living beings to survive, Predator. Oh, this was going to be fun. You're right, Marcus said, standing up as well. At 6'2", he was still considerably shorter than Zektal, but somehow he seemed to fill more of the room. You just need 16 hours of direct sunlight and a balanced mineral solution. Very impressive. I bet that works great in combat situations. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Professor Kethvar was making frantic gestures with his upper arms, the Zenthari version of "oh no, oh no, oh no." Perhaps we should return to the lesson, he suggested hopefully. Actually, Vrax rumbled, his rocky form grinding as he moved. I find myself curious about human combat capabilities. Your species files are heavily redacted in the Academy databases. Gee, I wonder why that could be, Marcus said, his grin widening. Maybe because every time we show up somewhere, the local ecosystem tends to file a formal complaint with the Galactic Conservation Authority. Seth hissed, literally hissed, and his hood flared in obvious aggression. Deathworlders think they're so impressive. All that bouncing around and sweating. Disgusting mammalian habits. Hey, at least we don't shed our skin in the communal showers. Marcus shot back. Do you know how many maintenance complaints we've gotten about clogged drains? Engineering is not happy with your people.
That did it.
All 4 of them were on their feet now, and the rest of the class was rapidly evacuating the area. Professor Kethvar had given up any pretense of maintaining order, and was frantically hitting the emergency alert button. You know what? Marcus said conversationally, rolling his shoulders in a way that made unpleasant popping sounds. I've been meaning to give you guys a practical demonstration of Deathworlder physiology anyway. This is perfect timing. He cracked his knuckles, and the sound echoed through the classroom like gunshots. Several students screamed, "Who wants to go first?" Now here's the thing about Deathworlders that most galactic species don't quite grasp until it's too late. We didn't claw our way to the top of Earth's food chain through superior technology or enlightened philosophy. We did it by being absolute nightmare fuel wrapped in a convenient bipedal package. Zektal, being from a warrior culture, naturally assumed he should be the first to teach this soft mammalian male a lesson about challenging his betters. He lunged forward with all 4 arms extended, razor-sharp claws gleaming under the classroom's artificial lighting. Marcus sidestepped with liquid grace, grabbed one of his extended arms, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the nearest desk. The furniture, designed for species with more reasonable bone density, crumpled like paper. "Oh, sorry," Marcus called out cheerfully. "Did I mention that human reaction time averages around 200 milliseconds? And that we've been persistence hunting for about 2 million years?" Vrax charged next, all half-ton of granite and attitude. His species had evolved on high-gravity worlds where tectonic activity was a daily occurrence. So naturally, he expected his rocky constitution to be more than a match for any squishy organic creature. Marcus dropped into a crouch, swept his legs. Do massive rock beings have legs? Let's call them locomotive appendages. And watched with satisfaction as he toppled backward with a sound like a small avalanche. The floor plates buckled under the impact. "Fun fact," he announced, casually dodging a strike from Siseth's venomous tail. "Humans evolved from pack hunters. We're really good at taking down things bigger than us." Seth was fast, really fast. His species had evolved to strike with lightning precision, injecting neurotoxins that could drop most galactic species in seconds. His fangs extended as he went for Marcus's neck. He caught the snake's head with both hands and headbutted him so hard that Seth's eyes crossed. The sound echoed through the classroom like a gong being struck. Seth collapsed into a twitching heap, making confused snake noises. "Also," Marcus added, rubbing his forehead, "human skulls are about 4 times thicker than most people expect. Really screws with the math when you're trying to inject venom through one." Morok, being a crystalline entity with roughly the intelligence of a supercomputer, and the emotional range of a particularly vindictive spreadsheet, had been analyzing the situation while his companions were getting systematically demolished. He'd calculated approximately 47 different attack vectors, and was preparing to execute the optimal strategy when Marcus looked directly at him. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've always wondered what happens when you apply percussive force to a crystal matrix. Want to help me find out?" Morok immediately began cycling through every negotiation protocol in his behavioral database. "Wait," he hummed, his crystalline form shifting colors rapidly. "Perhaps we can discuss this rationally. I acknowledge that I may have underestimated human capabilities." "That's sweet," Marcus said, advancing slowly. "But you called me an arrogant mammal. And honestly, my feelings are really hurt." He reached out and flicked him. Literally just flicked him with one finger. Right in what might generously be called his face. The harmonic resonance caused his entire structure to vibrate like a tuning fork struck by a hammer. He collapsed into a glittering pile of very confused crystal fragments. The classroom was now completely silent except for the sound of various alien species groaning in pain and the gentle hum of the life support systems. Marcus stood in the middle of what looked like a small-scale natural disaster, dusting off his hands with satisfaction. "So," he announced to the empty room, "anyone else want to discuss mammalian evolution?" The Academy's medical bay was not designed to handle this volume of what the incident report would eventually classify as acute cultural education injuries. Dr. Kethmora, the station's chief medical officer, was a healer-class Altrurian whose species had evolved specifically to fix other people's problems. He was very good at his job, but even he had limits. Let me understand this correctly, he said, his forearms working simultaneously to treat his patients while his main head addressed Marcus. You disabled 4 advanced combat students without using any weapons, technological augmentation, or chemical enhancement. Marcus shrugged. I mean, technically I used my fists, my head, and basic leverage principles. But yeah, pretty much. Dr. Kethmora's secondary head turned to examine Zektal, who was currently wrapped in enough biogauze to mummify a small building. Multiple fractures to the primary skeletal structure, severe contusions, and what appears to be a completely disrupted sense of spatial awareness. He'll be fine, Marcus said cheerfully. Vegans are tougher than they look. And this one, the doctor continued, gesturing at Vrax, has stress fractures throughout his mineral matrix. How did you even manage to damage a silicon-based life form with your bare hands? Physics, Marcus replied. Everything has a resonant frequency if you hit it at the right angle with enough force. Seth was curled up in the corner making distressed hissing sounds, his pupils dilated to pinpoints. The concussion alone should have rendered you unconscious, Dr. Kethmora observed. How are you still functional? Human skulls, Marcus explained patiently, are basically biological helmets filled with the most vindictive brain chemistry in known space. We're designed to keep functioning through injuries that would kill most species. Finally, the doctor turned to examine Morok, who had been carefully reassembled into his approximate original configuration, but was still occasionally flickering between different colors like a confused Christmas tree. Harmonic disruption trauma, Dr. Kethmora diagnosed. I've never seen anything like it. How did you know that would work? I didn't, Marcus admitted. I just figured that if you hit a crystal hard enough, something interesting would happen. The doctor's tertiary head began displaying rapid color changes, the Altrurian equivalent of a migraine. Cadet Vale, you realize this incident is going to require a formal review by the Academy board? Yeah, I figured. Marcus glanced around at his handiwork. In my defense, they started it. 4 against 1 is hardly fair odds, Dr. Kethmora pointed out. I know, right? I was really hoping for more of a challenge. The Academy board review was held 3 days later in Conference Room Alpha 7, a sterile white chamber designed to intimidate students and faculty alike. The 5 board members sat behind an imposing curved desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of space black marble. This was supposed to project authority and gravitas. What it actually projected was, we spent way too much money on interior decorating. Admiral Threxkin, a Dominion-class cetacean whose species had evolved in the methane seas of Titan Prime, floated in his specialized tank, his massive bulk rippling with barely contained displeasure. To his left sat Commander Yith, a hive-mind collective from the Outer Rim who spoke in perfect harmony with herself and found individual consciousness quaint but inefficient. Director Koloth represented the Academic Council, his crystalline form significantly more stable than Morok's had been earlier. Professor Emeritus Vektar was there representing faculty interests, her tentacles writhing nervously as she shuffled through data pads. And finally, there was Colonel Rex Morrison, one of only 2 humans on the Academy staff, whose job was basically to translate Deathworlder behavior for everyone else. Marcus sat in the defendant's chair, looking remarkably relaxed for someone facing potential expulsion from the most prestigious military academy in known space. Colonel Morrison was studying his file with the expression of someone who'd seen this particular movie before, and didn't like how it ended. Cadet Vale, Admiral Threxgon began, his voice resonating through the water of his containment tank. You stand accused of unprovoked assault against 4 fellow students during an academic session. With respect, Admiral, it wasn't unprovoked. They called me an arrogant mammal and questioned human evolutionary fitness. Where I come from, that's fighting words. Commander Yith's collective voice harmonized unpleasantly. We find your species' tendency toward violence deeply concerning. Civilized beings resolve disputes through discourse and mediation. That's adorable, Marcus replied. How's that working out for you in the contested systems? I hear the Korthak Empire is really impressed with your discourse skills. Colonel Morrison cleared his throat. Perhaps we could focus on the specific incident in question. Director Koloth consulted his datapad, his crystalline form shifting through various shades of administrative irritation. According to the medical report, you inflicted significant injuries on 4 students using only physical force. No weapons, no technology, no chemical enhancement. Is that supposed to be impressive? Because honestly, that's kind of Tuesday for most humans. Professor Vektar's tentacles writhed faster. The Academy's medical facilities are not equipped to handle regular incidents of this severity. We've had to request additional medical supplies 3 times since you enrolled. Hey, that's not all my fault. Remember the incident in engineering lab? That was Cadet Brextel who decided to mess with the gravity generators. I just happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. Admiral Threxkin made a sound like a whale gargling seawater. Cadet, your file contains 17 separate incident reports in 3 months. You've somehow managed to cause more administrative paperwork than the rest of your class combined. What can I say? I'm an overachiever. Commander Yeath leaned forward, her collective voice dropping to what was probably supposed to be a menacing whisper, but came across more like a very angry church choir. Do you understand the severity of your situation? You could be expelled from the Academy. Your species' membership in the Galactic Educational Consortium could be revoked. Marcus's casual demeanor shifted slightly. Not much, just enough to remind everyone in the room that he was, fundamentally, a predator trying very hard to play nice with the other children. Let me ask you something, he said, his voice carrying that particular edge that made most species' instinctive prey responses start screaming. How many combat encounters has this academy seen in the past 50 years? The board members exchanged glances. Director Koloth checked his records. The academy maintains strict neutrality. We've had 0 combat incidents. Right. And how many of your graduates have seen actual combat duty? The academy trains future leaders and diplomats, Professor Vektar said defensively. Not soldiers. Which explains why the Korthak Empire has been steadily eating chunks of consortium space for the past decade, while you guys keep sending strongly worded letters about the importance of peaceful resolution. Colonel Morrison was trying very hard not to smile. Cadet, what's your point? My point is that maybe, just maybe, having someone around who actually knows how to handle himself in a fight isn't such a bad thing. Especially since half the galaxy seems to think the consortium is a bunch of soft-shelled intellectuals who'll roll over the moment someone shows up with more firepower than a strongly worded petition. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Finally, Admiral Threxkin spoke. The Academy does not exist to train warriors, Cadet. No, but it's supposed to train leaders. And leaders sometimes have to make hard choices. They sometimes have to stand up to bullies. They sometimes have to fight. Marcus stood up, and despite being average height for his species, he somehow commanded everyone's attention. I didn't start that fight, but when 4 bigger, stronger students decided to gang up on me because they thought the soft mammalian would be an easy target, I finished it. Quickly, efficiently, and with minimal collateral damage. If that's not leadership material, then I honestly don't know what you're looking for. He looked directly at each board member in turn. But here's the thing you need to understand. Where I come from, you don't get to be the biggest predator on the planet by backing down from a fight. You get there by winning fights. And if that's too scary for your nice, civilized institution, then maybe this isn't the right place for my species anyway. The room was dead silent for several long moments. Finally, Colonel Morrison spoke. The board will recess to consider our decision. While the board deliberated, Marcus found himself in the Academy's observation lounge, staring out at the starfield through the massive transparent aluminum windows. Space was pretty, he had to admit. All those distant suns and swirling nebulae painted against the cosmic darkness, like someone had spilled glitter on black velvet. He wasn't alone for long. Colonel Morrison entered the lounge, looking every inch the career military officer, despite being technically civilian faculty now. He was what recruiters called recruiting poster handsome. Square jaw, steely eyes, the kind of presence that made junior officers stand a little straighter without being told. Mind if I join you? He asked. Marcus shrugged. Free galaxy. Morrison settled into one of the nearby chairs, designed for roughly human-proportioned beings, but comfortable enough for most species. Want to tell me what really happened in that classroom? I thought the security footage was pretty clear. The security footage shows 4 students attacking you and getting thoroughly trounced. What it doesn't show is why. Marcus was quiet for a moment, still staring out at the stars. You know what it's like being one of only 2 humans in a facility full of aliens who think your entire species is barely evolved from barbarian savages? Actually, I do. He glanced at him. Right. You went through all this too. 23 years ago. Different academy station, same basic prejudices. Morrison's expression was sympathetic. Let me guess. Constant comments about human aggression, human irrationality, human biological inadequacies, among other things. Today they decided to lecture me about mammalian arrogance while discussing human reproduction like we're some kind of freakish evolutionary accident. And you decided you'd had enough. They decided they were going to make an example of me. I just disagreed with their choice of example. Morrison laughed, actually laughed. You sound like me at your age, all righteous indignation and barely controlled violence. How'd that work out for you? Well, I'm here, aren't I? Made it through the academy, served 15 years in the consortium fleet, and now I teach the next generation of galactic leaders how to not get everyone killed through cultural ignorance. Marcus turned away from the window to study him. You think I screwed up? I think you did exactly what any human would do in that situation, which is both the problem and the solution. That's cryptic. Morrison leaned back in his chair. The galaxy has a problem, Cadet. Actually, it has several problems, but there's one big one that everyone's pretending doesn't exist. The consortium is soft. We've had 50 years of peace, prosperity, and philosophical debate, and it's made us weak. The Kortak thing? The Kortak thing is just the beginning. They're testing us, probing for weaknesses, seeing how far they can push before someone pushes back. And what they've found is that the consortium will talk and debate and form committees while entire star systems get swallowed up. Marcus frowned. So what's the solution? The solution is what you just demonstrated in that classroom. Sometimes when bullies decide to pick a fight, you have to be willing to finish it. The lounge door chimed, and Dr. Kethmora entered, his multiple heads scanning the room until he spotted them. Colonel Morrison, Cadet Vale, he said formally. I wanted to update you on the condition of the injured students. How are they? Marcus asked, and Morrison was pleased to note that he sounded genuinely concerned. They'll all make full recoveries, the doctor assured him, though I suspect their egos will take longer to heal than their bodies. Particularly Zektal. His people are having difficulty processing the concept of being defeated by someone he outweighs by 60 kilograms. Maybe he'll think twice before starting fights with people he doesn't understand, Morrison suggested. Perhaps? Dr. Kethmora hesitated. I hope you don't mind me asking, Cadet, but I've been reviewing human physiology data, and I'm curious about something. Shoot. According to the medical readouts, you sustained no significant injuries during the altercation, but you delivered enough force to fracture crystalline matrices and disrupt silicon-based nervous systems. How is that possible without causing corresponding damage to yourself? Marcus grinned that predator's grin that made most species uncomfortable. Doctor, human beings spent about 2 million years learning to kill things bigger, stronger, and meaner than us using nothing but our brains and our hands. We got really, really good at it. But surely the physical stress, human bones are hollow, Morrison interjected. Just like bird bones, but filled with a mineral matrix that's harder than most military-grade composites. Human muscles can generate roughly twice the force per kilogram of most mammalian species. And human pain tolerance is... He paused. Well, let's just say that what puts most species in the hospital barely registers as uncomfortable to us. Dr. Kethmora's primary head tilted in confusion. That seems evolutionarily excessive. It was, Marcus said cheerfully. Our planet tried to kill us for millions of years. Ice ages, supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, predators with teeth the size of kitchen knives, you name it. Earth threw it at us. The ones who survived were the ones who were too stubborn to die and too mean to quit. And now we're in space, Morrison added, sharing the galaxy with species who evolved on nice, safe, reasonable worlds, where the biggest threat was occasionally running out of optimal sunlight. The doctor made a sound like someone clearing 4 throats simultaneously. I'm beginning to understand why your species files are classified. The lounge door chimed again, and a junior officer entered. Colonel Morrison, the board is ready to reconvene. The second half of the disciplinary hearing had a different energy entirely. The board members seemed more subdued, and Marcus caught Colonel Morrison trying not to look smug. Admiral Threxkin floated in his tank, his massive form rippling with what might have been resignation. Cadet Vale, the board has reached a decision. Marcus straightened in his chair. Yes, sir. The charges of unprovoked assault are dismissed. The security footage clearly shows that you were attacked first and responded with appropriate defensive measures. Commander Yith's collective voice was slightly off-key, suggesting internal disagreement among her components. However, the board has concerns about your methods and the extent of the injuries inflicted. Which brings us to our decision, Director Koloth interjected, his crystalline form shifting to administrative yellow, apparently the color of reluctant compromise. You will not be expelled from the academy. Marcus felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying drain out of his shoulders. However, Admiral Threxkin continued, you will be placed on academic probation for the remainder of this semester. Any further incidents will result in immediate dismissal. Additionally, Professor Vektar added, her tentacles writhing nervously, you will be required to attend weekly sessions with the Academy's Cultural Integration Counselor. Marcus kept his expression neutral. Understood. There is one more thing, Colonel Morrison said, speaking for the first time during this session. The board has decided to implement a new program, and you're going to be our test case. What kind of program? Combat instruction, Admiral Threxgon said, his tone suggesting he was still not entirely comfortable with the decision. It has become apparent that the Academy's curriculum may be lacking in certain practical applications. Marcus blinked. You want me to teach other students how to fight? We want you to teach other students how to think like fighters, Morrison corrected. Strategy, tactics, threat assessment, conflict resolution through superior firepower. All the things that nice, civilized species never needed to learn. Commander Yith's harmony was distinctly Discord adjacent. The board feels that this knowledge may be necessary for future leaders, given current galactic tensions. Translation, Marcus said slowly. You're finally admitting that sometimes you have to punch the bully in the nose instead of trying to reason with him. That is a crude but not entirely inaccurate assessment, Director Koloth admitted. Professor Vektar leaned forward. You would be working under Colonel Morrison's supervision, of course. This program is entirely experimental. Marcus looked at Morrison, who was definitely trying not to smile now. What do you think, Colonel? Think you can handle working with an arrogant mammal? I think, Morrison said carefully, that it's about time this academy learned what humans bring to the table besides paperwork and diplomatic headaches. In that case, Marcus said, standing up and offering his most diplomatic smile, the one that only showed half his teeth. I'd be honored to serve. 2 months later, Marcus stood in Training Bay 12, watching as a class of 30 mixed-species cadets struggled through what he generously called basic threat assessment. Today's lesson was simple. Identify potential dangers in a seemingly normal environment and react appropriately. The environment he'd set up looked like a standard academy corridor. White walls, standard lighting, no obvious hazards. What the students didn't know was that he'd hidden 17 different threats throughout the space, from simple tripwires to more complex scenarios involving gravity manipulation and atmospheric changes. His students were a mixed bag. There was Kexthor, a young vegan who'd transferred into the program specifically to understand how his people had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by a single human male. Sitting next to him was Felnara, a crystalline being from the same species as Morok. She joined after watching security footage of the classroom incident and deciding she needed to understand how harmonic resonance could be weaponized. The class also included several other species he'd never seen before. A gaseous life form from the Nebula territories who existed in a containment suit, a plant person from the garden worlds who communicated through chemical releases, and what appeared to be a sentient mathematical equation from the abstract realms. All right, people, Marcus announced, his voice carrying easily across the training bay. Today we're going to discuss something your species probably never had to worry about, predator recognition. He gestured to the mock corridor. This looks like a perfectly safe academy hallway. Who can tell me what's wrong with it? A few hands went up, well, appendages that served similar functions. Marcus pointed to Yelnara, a cetacean whose species had evolved in peaceful deep ocean environments. The lighting is slightly dimmer than standard? She suggested uncertainly. Good catch, but that's environmental control, not a threat. Anyone else? Kexthor raised one of his forearms. The corridor is too narrow for rapid evacuation in case of emergency. Better, but still thinking like an engineer instead of like prey. Here's a hint. On Earth, when our ancestors encountered an environment like this, their first instinct was to assume something was waiting to eat them, because usually something was. He walked over to the mock corridor and pointed to a section of wall that looked identical to every other section of wall. There's a concealed alcove here, just big enough for a medium-sized predator to hide in. The slight discoloration in the floor plating indicates recent disturbance. Something heavy was moved here recently. And if you look at the air circulation patterns, there's a slight dead zone right here where the scent of an ambush predator might linger. The students were staring at him like he'd just performed magic. How did you see all that? The gaseous life form asked, his voice coming through the translation speakers with a distinct wheeze of confusion. Practice, Marcus said simply. 2 million years of it. When your ancestors were busy evolving better photosynthetic processes or more efficient mineral absorption, mine were learning to spot the thing that wanted to eat them before it was too late. He pressed a hidden control, and the wall section slid away to reveal a concealed compartment exactly where he'd indicated. Several students jumped. The thing is, Marcus continued, this isn't just about identifying physical threats. It's about understanding that in any situation, someone might be trying to kill you. It's about thinking 3 steps ahead. It's about being ready. Felnara's crystalline form shifted to what Marcus had learned was academic orange. But surely such constant vigilance is exhausting. How do your people function in peaceful situations? Marcus grinned, the friendly version this time, with only minimal visible teeth. We don't really do peaceful situations. Even when everything seems calm, part of our brain is still scanning for threats, calculating escape routes, identifying potential weapons in our immediate environment. He gestured around the training bay. Right now, without thinking about it, I know there are 6 exits from this room. 4 of them are blocked by students. The emergency oxygen system can be activated from 3 different panels, and that section of wall plating could be removed and used as a shield or improvised weapon. The silence that followed was profound. That sounds terrifying, the plant person said, releasing a cloud of what the translator identified as concerned pheromones. It's not terrifying when you're used to it, Marcus replied. It's just being prepared, and being prepared is what keeps you alive when something goes wrong. Colonel Morrison chose that moment to enter the training bay, and Marcus was pleased to see that several of his students had noticed his arrival before he announced himself. They were learning. How's the class coming along, Instructor Vale? They're starting to think like prey animals instead of furniture, Marcus said. It's progress. Morrison surveyed the group of students, most of whom still looked slightly shell-shocked by the revelations about constant threat assessment. Any questions for Instructor Vale? The sentient mathematical equation raised what might have been a hand. Instructor, is it true that human children play games that simulate combat scenarios? Oh yeah. Tag, hide and seek, capture the flag, dodgeball. Basically every game we invented involves either hunting something, avoiding being hunted, or pelting someone with projectiles. And this is considered normal? This is considered fun, Marcus corrected. We literally play war games for entertainment. More stunned silence. I think, Morrison said diplomatically, that's enough existential crisis for one day. Class dismissed. As the students filed out, chattering excitedly in a dozen different languages, Morrison turned to Marcus. You know, when I first recommended this program, I thought it would be about teaching basic self-defense and tactical awareness. And now? Now I'm starting to think we're accidentally running a course in advanced psychological warfare. He shook his head. These kids are never going to look at a normal corridor the same way again. Marcus laughed. Welcome to thinking like a human, Colonel. Once you start seeing the world as a place where everything might be trying to kill you, it's really hard to go back to the naive perspective. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? He considered this seriously. It depends. Are we still pretending the Korthak Empire is going to be satisfied with strongly worded letters and diplomatic protests? Morrison's expression grew serious. Actually, that's something I wanted to discuss with you. We've been getting some interesting intelligence reports from the border systems. Interesting how? The kind of interesting that makes Admiral Threxgon nervous, which is saying something since his species doesn't really do nervous. Morrison gestured toward the exit. Walk with me. They left the training bay and headed down one of the Academy's main corridors. Marcus automatically noted the sightlines, potential cover positions, and structural weak points, habits that had become so ingrained he barely realized he was doing it anymore. The Korthak Empire has been testing our response times, Morrison continued in a lower voice. Probing raids, communications interference, navigation errors that put their ships uncomfortably close to consortium space. Standard expansion tactics, Marcus observed. See how far you can push before someone pushes back. Exactly. And so far, the consortium's response has been exactly what you'd expect. Diplomatic protests, economic sanctions, strongly worded resolutions from the Galactic Council. Let me guess. The Korthak Empire is real impressed by our stern disapproval. They've accelerated their expansion schedule by 300% in the last 6 months. Marcus stopped walking. 300%? That's not gradual expansion anymore. That's conquest preparation. Which brings me to why I wanted to talk to you. Morrison's tone was carefully neutral. Your combat instruction program has been more successful than anyone anticipated. The students aren't just learning tactics, they're learning to think strategically, to assess threats, to make hard decisions under pressure. And Admiral Threxgon wants to expand the program, academy-wide implementation, mandatory for all senior cadets. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's a pretty significant policy shift for an institution dedicated to peaceful diplomatic solutions. The galaxy is changing, whether we want it to or not. The question is whether we change with it or get left behind. They resumed walking, passing groups of students from dozens of different species. Most of them looked like exactly what they were. Young, idealistic beings from peaceful worlds who'd grown up believing that all conflicts could be resolved through rational discussion and mutual understanding. There's something else, Morrison said as they approached the Academy's central hub. We've received a request from Consortium Fleet Command. They want to establish a new training facility specifically for what they're calling asymmetric conflict scenarios. Translation? How to fight an enemy that doesn't follow the same rules you do. Morrison paused at one of the observation windows overlooking the Academy's central plaza. They want you to help design the curriculum. Marcus stared out at the plaza, where hundreds of students from across the galaxy were going about their daily routines. It was a beautiful sight, really. All these different species learning together, sharing knowledge, building relationships that would hopefully keep the peace for generations to come. But he was also seeing it through human eyes, and human eyes were very good at spotting potential problems. How many of these kids have ever been in a real fight? He asked. Before your combat instruction program, effectively zero. How many of them understand that sometimes diplomacy fails, and you have to be ready for what comes next? That number is increasing daily, thanks to your classes. Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching a group of cetacean students discussing what appeared to be advanced mathematics, while a cluster of crystalline beings nearby debated the philosophical implications of consciousness in non-carbon-based life forms. You know what the real problem is? He said finally. Enlighten me. We're trying to teach sheep how to think like wolves, and that's a hard thing to do without fundamentally changing what they are. Morrison considered this. Is that necessarily a bad thing? I don't know. Ask me in 10 years when we see what kind of leaders we've produced. The conversation was interrupted by the Academy's general announcement system crackling to life. All students and faculty report to designated emergency stations immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Marcus and Morrison exchanged glances. Emergency drills were scheduled events, announced well in advance. Unscheduled emergency alerts meant something had gone very, very wrong. Any idea what that's about? Marcus asked. Morrison was already activating his personal communicator. Morrison to Command Center, what's our status? The response came through with the distinctive static of high-priority military encryption. Colonel, we have multiple unidentified vessels approaching Academy Station 7. They're not responding to hails, and their trajectory suggests hostile intent. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. How many ships? Morrison relayed the question and listened to the response. His expression grew grim. 15 heavy cruisers, unknown configuration. They'll be in weapons range in 30 minutes. Korthak? Unknown. The ship designs don't match anything in our databases. Marcus looked out at the plaza, where students were now moving with the controlled urgency of emergency protocols. Most of them looked nervous but not particularly frightened. After all, what could possibly threaten the Academy? It was neutral territory, protected by every major power in the galaxy. Colonel, he said quietly, I think we're about to find out how well our students have been paying attention in class. The Academy's command center was a testament to the Consortium's faith in peaceful solutions. It was designed primarily for traffic control and communications, with defensive capabilities that were more theoretical than practical. Admiral Threxkin floated in his command tank, his massive form rippling with agitation as he processed the incoming data. Status report, Morrison demanded as he and Marcus entered the center. Commander Yith, her collective consciousness spread across multiple communication stations, responded in her characteristic harmony. 15 vessels, heavy cruiser class, approaching on attack vector. No response to any communication attempts across all frequencies. Identification? Negative. Ship configurations are unknown, but energy signatures suggest advanced military technology. Marcus moved to one of the sensor stations and began studying the tactical display. The approaching ships were arranged in a standard attack formation, 3 wings of 5 ships each, with overlapping fields of fire and mutual support positioning. Whoever they are, they know what they're doing, he observed. This isn't a raid or a probe. This is an assault formation. Admiral Threxkin's voice resonated through his tank's speakers. The Academy maintains strict neutrality. We have no military assets, no strategic value. What could they possibly want? Marcus looked at him with something approaching pity. Admiral, we're a school full of the next generation of galactic leaders. If someone wanted to cripple the Consortium's future leadership capacity, this would be exactly where they'd hit. The color drained from Threxkin's form. Apparently cetaceans went pale when terrified, just like humans. Our defensive capabilities are minimal, Commander Yith reported. Standard deflector shields, basic point defense systems, and a handful of security cutters that were never intended for military engagement. What about evacuation? Morrison asked. With 3,000 students and faculty, we'd need 6 hours minimum, and that's assuming perfect coordination and no interference. Which we don't have, Marcus said grimly. 25 minutes until they're in weapons range, maybe 30 if we're lucky. The command center fell silent, except for the soft hum of electronic systems and the gentle bubbling of Admiral Threxkin's tank. Everyone was looking at everyone else, waiting for someone to have a brilliant idea that would solve their impossible situation. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Admiral, with your permission, I'd like to implement Emergency Protocol 7. Threxkon's eyes focused on him with laser intensity. "Emergency Protocol 7 doesn't exist, Cadet." "It does now." Marcus moved to the central command console. "I'm going to need access to the Academy's internal communications system, all available security personnel, and about 20 of my best combat instruction students." "What are you planning?" Morrison asked. Marcus's grin was pure predator, the kind that had been sending prey animals running for cover for millions of years. "I'm planning to remind the galaxy why you don't pick fights with Deathworlders." 20 minutes later, the Academy had been transformed from a peaceful educational institution into something that would have made humanity's military ancestors proud. Every corridor had been turned into a potential killing field, with improvised barriers and concealed positions covering all major approaches. The students who weren't actively involved in defensive preparations had been moved to the most secure sections of the station, while Marcus's combat instruction graduates had been distributed throughout the Academy as squad leaders and tactical coordinators. Marcus himself was in the main docking bay, which intelligence suggested would be the primary target for any boarding action. He was wearing standard Academy security armor, which was designed more for crowd control than actual combat, and carrying a standard-issue plasma rifle that he'd already modified in 3 different ways that would probably void the warranty. With him were 30 mixed-species students, all graduates of his combat instruction program, all looking nervous but determined. Kexthor was there, his forearms steady as he checked his weapon. Felnara had positioned herself near the main power coupling, where her crystalline form could interface directly with the station's systems. Even Yelnara, the peaceful cetacean, had volunteered for the defense force. Apparently her people's pacifist philosophy had some interesting exceptions when it came to protecting educational institutions. "Remember," Marcus called out to his makeshift squad, "we're not trying to win a straight fight here. We're buying time for evacuation and hoping that Consortium fleet gets our distress signal before these guys decide to glass the station." "What if they don't try to board?" Kexthor asked. "What if they just attack from range?" "Then we die gloriously in the finest tradition of last stands throughout the galaxy," Marcus replied cheerfully. "But I don't think that's what they're here for. If they wanted to destroy the Academy, they could have done it from long range with minimal risk." The docking bay's main screen lit up with an incoming transmission. The image that appeared was unlike anything in the Consortium's extensive databases, a being that seemed to be part organic, part mechanical, with multiple arms ending in what looked like weapon mounts rather than hands. "Academy Station 7, the being said in accented but clear galactic standard. "You will prepare for immediate boarding and surrender. Resistance will be met with termination." Marcus looked around at his students, most of whom appeared to be experiencing their first real taste of mortal terror. It was not an entirely unpleasant sensation, he reflected. Terror had a way of clarifying priorities and eliminating distractions. "Well," he announced to the docking bay in general, "I guess that answers the question about their intentions." He activated his communicator. "Command Center, this is Docking Bay Alpha. Hostile forces are demanding surrender and preparing to board. Recommend you tell them we'll consider their proposal right after they explain who they are and what they want." Admiral Threxagon's voice came through the speakers. "Cadet Vale, perhaps we should consider negotiation. These beings may be reasonable." "Admiral," Marcus interrupted. "They showed up with 15 heavy cruisers in attack formation, and their opening move was to demand surrender. That's not the behavior of reasonable beings interested in negotiation." The deck plating vibrated slightly as the first enemy ships made contact with the Academy's docking ports. Marcus could hear the distinctive sound of cutting torches beginning their work on the outer hull. "All right, people," he called out to his defenders. "This is what we've been training for. Remember your sight lines, watch your crossfire, and don't waste ammunition on fancy shooting. Aim for center mass and keep firing until the target stops moving." Felnara's crystalline form shifted to combat red. "Instructor Vale, what if we can't stop them?" Marcus checked his weapon one final time and took position behind a hastily constructed barrier made from docking equipment and prayer. "Then we make them pay such a high price for this place that whoever sent them will think twice before trying it again." The first breach charge detonated with a sound like thunder, and suddenly the docking bay was full of smoke, flashing lights, and beings in advanced combat armor who moved with the fluid precision of professional soldiers. Marcus's first shot took the lead boarder center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the deck. His second shot caught the border behind him in what appeared to be a critical system junction, judging by the sparks and screaming. Around him, his students were putting their training to excellent use. Kexthor's four-armed fighting style was perfectly suited to the multi-directional threat environment, while Felinara had somehow turned herself into a living weapon turret that could track multiple targets simultaneously. But it quickly became clear that they were seriously outmatched. The boarders had better armor, better weapons, and a lot more experience with this kind of thing. "Fall back to secondary positions!" Marcus shouted over the sound of weapons fire and exploding equipment. "Fighting retreat by the numbers!" His students began moving with the controlled discipline he'd drilled into them, falling back through prepared positions while maintaining covering fire. It was beautiful to watch, really. All these kids from peaceful species, executing complex military maneuvers they'd learned in theoretical classes just weeks ago. Of course, it was also completely hopeless. They were buying time, nothing more. Marcus was bringing up the rear when he heard something that made his heart skip a beat. The distinctive whine of consortium fleet engines coming in fast and low. "All defenders, this is Admiral Chen aboard the CNS Retribution," came a voice over the emergency frequencies. "Cavalry has arrived. Take cover and let us handle this." Through the docking bay's transparent sections, Marcus could see the sleek forms of consortium warships engaging the enemy vessels. Plasma bolts and missile trails lit up space like a deadly fireworks display. But the boarding action was still in progress, and Marcus's defenders were still seriously outnumbered. That's when Kexthor did something that surprised everyone, including himself. The young vegan, who'd joined the combat program specifically to understand how he'd been so thoroughly outfought by a single human, suddenly stood up from behind his cover and let out a sound that could only be described as a war cry. His species didn't do war cries. They were civilized, peaceful, reasonable beings who solved conflicts through discourse. But apparently, spending months learning to think like a predator had awakened something in him that had been dormant for centuries of peaceful evolution. He charged. Not tactically, not strategically, just pure berserker rage channeled through four arms and a complete disregard for personal safety. The enemy boarders, trained to fight civilized opponents who behaved predictably, were completely unprepared for a 7-foot-tall plant person screaming like a banshee and swinging improvised weapons with homicidal enthusiasm. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Here was a member of one of the galaxy's most peaceful species acting like a human, and it broke something fundamental in the enemy's tactical programming, which gave Marcus the opening he needed. "All defenders advance and engage!" he shouted, and suddenly the docking bay was full of Academy students who'd spent months learning to think like humans, acting like humans. It was terrifying and beautiful and completely insane. The enemy boarders, faced with a coordinated assault by beings who were supposed to be harmless academics, did what any reasonable military force would do when confronted with something outside their operational parameters. They retreated. "Docking Bay Alpha to Command Center," Marcus reported, breathing hard and bleeding from a dozen minor cuts. "Boarding force repelled. Docking Bay secured." "Outstanding work, Cadet," Admiral Threxagon replied, and for the first time since Marcus had met him, he sounded genuinely impressed. "Fleet Admiral Chen reports that the enemy vessels are withdrawing. Whatever you did down there, it worked." Marcus looked around at his students, his fellow defenders, most of whom were staring at their hands like they couldn't quite believe what they'd just done. "Instructor Vale," Yelnara said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "Is this what it feels like to be human?" Marcus considered the question seriously. Around them, the docking bay was a wreck of damaged equipment and scattered debris. The air smelled like ozone and fear and victory. "No," he said finally. "This is what it feels like to be alive." The after-action review was held in the same conference room where Marcus had faced disciplinary charges just 5 months earlier. But this time the atmosphere was very different. Admiral Threxagon floated in his tank, no longer radiating bureaucratic displeasure, but something that might have been respect. Commander Yith's collective consciousness seemed more harmonious than usual. Director Koloth had shifted to what Marcus had learned was gratitude gold, and for the first time since he'd arrived at the Academy, Professor Vektar's tentacles were still. "Cadet Vale," Admiral Threxagon began, "the Academy owes you a considerable debt. Your tactical coordination during the boarding action undoubtedly saved lives and prevented the capture of this facility. It was a team effort, Admiral. My students performed magnificently." "Indeed they did, which raises some interesting questions about the Academy's future curriculum." Colonel Morrison leaned forward. "The combat instruction program has exceeded all expectations. Students who completed the course didn't just perform better during the crisis. They performed at levels comparable to trained military personnel." Commander Yith's harmony carried a note of wonderment. Beings from species with no history of violence coordinated complex military operations with minimal direct supervision. It should not have been possible. But it was, Marcus said simply. Because they learned to think differently. They learned to see potential threats, to plan for contingencies, to act decisively under pressure. Director Koloth consulted his datapad. Preliminary reports from Fleet Admiral Chen suggest that our attackers were from the Kortak Empire, using previously unknown ship configurations and tactics. A probe, Marcus said immediately. They wanted to see how we'd respond to a direct attack on a civilian target. And what did they learn? Professor Vektar asked. Marcus grinned, the friendly version with minimal visible teeth. They learned that the consortium isn't as soft as they thought. Admiral Threxkin made that gargling sound that indicated deep thought. The board has reached a unanimous decision regarding the Academy's future direction. Oh? Effective immediately, combat instruction becomes a mandatory course for all Academy students. The curriculum will be expanded to include strategic planning, threat assessment, and what Colonel Morrison calls asymmetric thinking. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's a pretty significant policy change. The galaxy has changed, Commander Yith said simply. We must change with it or become irrelevant. There's more, Morrison added. Fleet Command has approved the establishment of a new advanced tactical studies program. They want you to head it up. Are you offering me a promotion? We're offering you the chance to fundamentally reshape how the consortium trains its future leaders, Admiral Threxgon said. The choice is yours. Marcus looked around the conference room, the same room where, 5 months ago, he'd faced expulsion for doing exactly what he'd been trained to do. Now they were offering him the chance to train others to do the same thing. Will I still be able to teach regular classes? Work with individual students? That would be part of your duties, Morrison confirmed. And I'd have a free hand in developing curriculum? Within reason, Director Koloth said carefully. Marcus stood up and walked to the conference room's observation window. Outside, he could see Academy students going about their daily routines. But now he knew that many of them had faced life-or-death situations and risen to the challenge. They'd learned to think like predators, to act like warriors, to protect what mattered to them. You know, he said thoughtfully, 5 months ago you all thought I was a dangerous savage who didn't belong in civilized society. We were wrong, Admiral Threxkin admitted. Your people's capabilities were underestimated. No, Marcus said, turning back to face the board. You weren't wrong about us being dangerous. You were wrong about that being a bad thing. He returned to his chair and looked each board member in the eye. I accept your offer, but I have some conditions. Name them, Morrison said. First, no restrictions on curriculum content. If I'm going to teach future leaders how to think like humans, they need to understand the full spectrum of what that means. Agreed. Second, I want access to real intelligence data. My students need to understand actual threats, not theoretical scenarios. Admiral Threxkin's form rippled with what might have been discomfort, but he nodded. Within appropriate security limitations. Third, I want to establish an exchange program with Earth military academies. My students need to understand where this kind of thinking comes from. That could be arranged, Director Koloth said carefully. And finally, Marcus said, grinning that predator's grin that had become his trademark, I want official recognition that sometimes the best way to keep the peace is to be very, very good at war. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Admiral Threxkin spoke. Instructor Vale, welcome to the faculty. Epilogue, 18 months later. The Kortak Empire never did launch a full-scale invasion of consortium space. According to intelligence reports, their leadership was having some difficulty explaining to their military how a soft civilian target had managed to repel a professional boarding force using nothing but Academy students and improvised tactics. The Academy's combat instruction program had been expanded to include every student, regardless of species or previous experience. The graduation rate had actually improved. Apparently, learning to think strategically and handle pressure had benefits that extended well beyond military applications. Marcus stood in his new office, reviewing applications for the Advanced Tactical Studies program. He'd received over 4,000 applications for 50 slots, from students representing every major species in the consortium, including, rather ironically, several from the Kortak Empire. The door chimed, and he looked up to see Colonel Morrison entering with someone Marcus didn't recognize. A young human woman in cadet uniform. Instructor Vale, Morrison said formally. I'd like you to meet Cadet Sarah Chen. She's just transferred here from the Mars Military Academy. and she'll be joining your advanced program. Marcus studied the newcomer. She had that particular alertness that marked someone who'd grown up in a genuinely dangerous environment, and her handshake was firm without being aggressive. Professional. Welcome to the Academy, Cadet Chen. What's your background? Asteroid mining security, sir. 3 years in the belt, dealing with pirates, claim jumpers, and the occasional corporate raider. Marcus exchanged a glance with Morrison. They'd been hoping for more human instructors with real-world experience. Excellent. How do you feel about teaching basic combat awareness to a class of beings who think violence is a theoretical concept? Sarah's grin was pure predator, the kind that had been making alien species nervous for months now. Sounds like fun, sir. A soft chime indicated someone else at the door. Come in. Kexthor entered, now wearing instructor's insignia and looking considerably more confident than the nervous young Vegan who'd first challenged Marcus in xenobiology class 18 months ago. Instructor Vale, do you have a moment? I wanted to discuss the new curriculum proposals for next semester. Always. What's on your mind? Kexthor settled into one of the visitor chairs, reinforced models that could accommodate a variety of species. I've been thinking about what you said, that day in the docking bay, about feeling alive. And? My people have a saying, the flower that never faces wind never grows strong. I used to think it was just a pretty metaphor about adversity building character. Marcus waited patiently. One thing he'd learned about teaching was that sometimes the most important lessons came from letting students reach their own conclusions. But it's not a metaphor, is it? Kexthor continued. It's literally true. Species that never face real challenges don't develop the capabilities to handle real threats. That's a very human way of looking at it. I've been learning to think like a human for 18 months now. It's addictive. Marcus laughed. Fair warning. Once you start seeing the world as a place where everything might be trying to kill you, it's really hard to go back to the naive perspective. Would you want to go back? He considered this seriously. No, because naive perspectives get people killed when the real monsters show up. Kexthor nodded slowly. That's what I thought you'd say. He stood up to leave, then paused. Instructor, thank you. For what? For teaching us that sometimes the best way to preserve peace is to be really, really good at war. After he left, Marcus returned to his application reviews. The galaxy was changing, and the consortium was changing with it. Future leaders were learning to think strategically, to assess threats, to make hard decisions when soft options weren't available. It was, he reflected, a very human approach to galactic politics. And it seemed to be working. Outside his office window, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the political concerns of the various species that crawled around on planets orbiting them. But for the first time since joining the galactic community, humanity's approach to those political concerns was being taken seriously. Marcus smiled, the friendly version, with only minimal visible teeth, and got back to work. After all, there were future warriors to train. The Academy had learned an important lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the galaxy isn't a weapon or a warship. It's someone who knows how to think like a predator and is willing to teach others to do the same. And as the Korthak Empire was slowly discovering, that kind of knowledge spread faster than they could contain it. The sheep were learning to be wolves, and the wolves were very, very good teachers.